Hello and welcome back to the science and art of open water swimming. Today's episode is a slightly different format, and I just want to give you a bit of context before we get started. What you're about to hear is a conversation I've recently recorded as a guest on another podcast, The Distance Doctor in Practice, hosted by Dr Kate Baldwin. Kate and I had a long, thoughtful discussion around body composition in endurance sport, where some of our common beliefs come from, how they're often oversimplified, and what actually matters when it comes to health, performance, and longevity. While the conversation spans endurance sport more broadly, there are some very direct and important connections to open water swimming, particularly when we start talking about buoyancy, thermoregulation, robustness, and how different bodies interact with the aquatic environment. Kate very generously gave permission for this episode to be rebroadcast here, and I've kept the original conversation intact out of respect for her work and her audience. I'd strongly encourage you to also check out Distance Doctor in Practice. Kate does an excellent job of bridging clinical insights with real-world endurance sport, and I've included links in the show notes. So with that context in mind, this is my conversation with Dr. Kate Baldwin, originally recorded for the Distance Doctor in Practice. I hope you find it thought-provoking and useful as you think about performance, readiness, and what really matters in open water swimming.
Today we are talking about something that sits quietly underneath a lot of endurance sports conversations, but probably shapes athlete thinking more than almost anything else, and that's body weight. If you spend enough time around endurance sport, you will hear the same message again and again. Lighter is better, leaner is faster, and body fat is somehow the thing that stands between you and your next breakthrough. It's been repeated so often that for a lot of athletes, it barely feels like an opinion anymore, it just feels like a fact. But the reality of this is a lot more complicated than that. Yes, body composition can matter. In some contexts, excess non-functional mass may influence performance. But at the same time, endurance sport has built a huge amount of culture around numbers that are easy to measure without always asking whether they are the most meaningful numbers, whether we're interpreting them properly, or whether we are chasing a metric at the expense of health, robustness, or even performance itself. So in today's episode, it's going to be about pulling that apart. So to help me unpack this, I'm joined by Dr. Grant Landers. He's a senior lecturer in sports science at the University of Western Australia, and his expertise spans athlete performance assessment, applied sports science, environmental physiology, and he even leads a cross-disciplinary research program on human performance in extreme environments, particularly open water swimming. His work has ranged from athlete monitoring and body composition assessment, and he's also helped with the development of routine optimization tools, which are now used by the majority of the Rottnest Channel Swim participants. And if that wasn't enough, that is quite the intro. He's also done the Rottnest Channel Swim himself. He is an experienced endurance athlete. So quite the intro there, Grant. Thank you very much for joining me.
You're welcome, Kate. It's nice to join you and have a chat today.
Yes, excellent. So I just want to start at the basics with you on this topic. So when we are talking about body composition in athletes, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking body mass, fat mass, adipose tissue, all of the above, other things?
Yeah, so I think whenever you ask anyone about body composition, the first thing they tend to think about, and they go straight to body fat. And look, it's understandable. Historically, that's what we've measured. All our tools allow us to measure those things. It's built around understanding and estimating percent fat. But body composition obviously is a lot more than that. That is only one component. And if we look over what are the different parts of it, yeah, fat mass is a bit, but we also have skeletal mass. We've got bone mineral density, organ mass, how much body water do we have, it's the amount of skin we have. And how we break those down can be quite different depending on what we're actually looking at and how it then relates to performance. But I guess body composition is quite often it's more about how we might see an athlete, but is it really the things that we use to determine performance? And so it's just a part of that profile for the athlete. Along with things like strength and power and injury risk, etc., those sorts of things.
And I feel like those things almost come secondary in a lot of the conversations, or they used to at least, and I do feel like there is a change in this landscape. And that kind of leads me on to the next thing I wanted to ask you, which was, why do you think endurance sport has become especially in the past, like I said, I do feel like it's changing, but why do you think it is so focused on body weight and this belief that lighter is faster? Was it based on evidence originally, and has it been over extrapolated and oversimplified over time?
Yeah, I guess there are a couple of reasons for it. The first one is from a simple physics perspective. Yeah, if I reduce the amount of mass that I have to move, especially in a land-based sport, so if I'm looking at running, cycling, those sorts of things, and going over mountains, if I'm lighter, then I don't need to use as much energy to do that work. And then the second one, which I sort of alluded to earlier, was that we've got this measurement history. What could we actually measure? And other than just outright mass, we learnt how to measure body fat. And because body fat itself is fairly consistent through the body. And so with that and knowing how to measure it, just became a tool that we utilised and went, okay, well, if I can reduce that, it seems like fat is a non-functional part of performance. And therefore, if I can reduce that part, I will be lighter and therefore I can perform faster in most cases. So is it lighter equals faster? It's very simplistic if we think about it like that. I guess if I look at it from that lighter equals faster and having come from a triathlon background primarily, and think about when I used to ride bikes from over 30 years ago, we all had steel frames. It was a steel frame bike. That was the composition of the bike. It was heavy, and then through the next 10 years or so, then it was like, oh, can we use aluminium? How can we change the composition to make it lighter? And then we've moved into more carbon-based frames. And again, it increases or it changes the composition. It makes it lighter. But what happened with a lot of these changes is the integrity of the bike changed. And so quite often they failed. The bottom brackets broke. And we saw people with carbon wheels that were collapsing during races, seat posts broke, all those sorts of things. So although we went with this lighter option because it seemed faster, we still had this potential for it to break down. We now have a lot more knowledge in that space and the frames have become stronger. And I think that's the same thing with the athlete. We need to consider that, yes, being lighter might help, but not at the expense of being able to be a robust athlete. How is that going to impact performance? Are we strong enough? Do we recover? Are our bones going to break? They're the sort of things that we need to consider primarily because the performance of the athlete is the number one.
I love that analogy that you've just given about the bike frames because it really is so relatable. And you might think, oh, I'm going to rock up to the start line of this race and I've got the lightest bike, so I should be the fastest. There's no point if you're braking halfway through, or if it breaks in training, you don't even get to the start line. I see this a lot. And I was reading one of the latest, I think it was the 2023 publication, the expert consensus on, body weight and body composition. And it was saying how it needs to consider exactly what you said, the robustness of the athlete. And one of their summaries was, across sports, gains in muscle mass show performance benefits more consistently than chasing low fat mass. And that was one of the biggest things that added to the research. And it's right because... And it's even when we look into our strength training research and people go, oh, I have a fear of bulking up. I'm like, first of all, you're not really going to from the strength training that I'm giving you. But second of all, there is space for you to increase that lean mass and it's going to help your performance as well. It doesn't only seem to be a concern about adipose tissue, but it's also even in some cases about being muscular. And I find that a lot of athletes, I do find female athletes get to the start line, they go, I'm bigger than these girls. They're smaller than me. They're going to move faster. But I don't see that the case quite so much anymore.
No, look, it is changing. And we're in a sport with triathlon, with cycling, with swimming, where what we wear, it's very revealing. We can't hide what we look like. Yeah. And quite often there is that judgment around that space, which can make people feel quite challenged. But like you said, in terms of the lean mass, the importance of that, and if we look at longevity, having strength in our older age is a really important component. Looking at the fat mass in these older people doesn't necessarily relate to that longevity component as much as the lean mass and maintaining strength and being able to do everyday tasks. And I think that it holds true for our endurance athletes as well.
Yeah. And so that lighter equals faster. If you had to say true or false, I'm putting you on the spot here, Grant. True or false?
In most, look, look, you know the answer to this. It depends. It depends. There's always scope to optimize different aspects of our body in terms of our preparation. But I think if we're looking at that, and if we do all the training right and we fuel correctly and we recover correctly, our body will adapt. And quite often that might lead to a leaner athlete or a lighter athlete. But there will be a point where if we become too light or too lean, then the health will suffer and we'll struggle with the other aspects of consistency of training and be able to compete.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you did do work in your earlier triathlon research where you did find a relationship between adiposity and performance in elite triathletes. How should that be, I guess, interpreted correctly by athletes? Because am I right in saying that that was more of an association, or can you take me through that a little bit and making sure athletes don't misunderstand that? And also if it's changed, because I know that was a little while ago.
A little while ago. It was based on the 97 world champs. So we're talking 30 years ago.
Exactly, because I know there's been a change obviously in the landscape, like I was saying, and also the different distances now as well.
Yeah, so it was based on Olympic distance triathlon at the time where it was moving from non-drafting to draft legal in the lead up to Sydney Games. And part of it was just to profile what the athletes were at that time. Now, at no point is it sort of saying this is optimal or every athlete was healthy. It was just a snapshot of this is what the athletes were on race day at World Champs or in the 2 weeks prior. So we weren't studying weight loss. We weren't studying could we improve by changing that. We were looking at what are the profiles of those successful athletes? What did they turn up with? Now, adiposity, yes, it certainly correlated with performance, but we also, in that, we were comparing junior athletes to senior athletes. We were comparing males to females. And obviously there's an underlying maturity level, and that could be, so as we go through growth and development, our body mass will change and the composition of that body mass will change. So how much lean mass. So the junior males had a lot less lean muscle mass than the senior males. The junior females had more body fat than the senior females. So the maturity levels of the junior females were similar because they're sort of 16 to 19, but they hadn't had the training age and they hadn't had the opportunity to develop through that training. So I guess that puts a little bit of perspective in terms of what we were trying to understand. The other side of that project also showed, though, that lever lengths, the proportionality of upper limb and lower limb, had an impact on performance. So those that were proportionally longer in their arms and legs generally were able to perform at a much better level. Now, we can't control that. It's genetically determined. It didn't mean that tall athletes or short athletes would have an advantage at that stage. And again, triathlon has evolved in 30 years, so I'm not going to speak for what's actually going on now. But if we look at different sports, basketball players are generally tall. Gymnasts and divers are generally short. So there's going to be some characteristics within those athletes that might predispose them to having greater success.
And this is where I feel like there's a potential, well, I think that what may have gone on was a lot of coaches may look at that study or just look at the abstract and go, oh, see, you have to be really lean to perform at the highest level, and then take that information and apply it. Do you see that happen, I guess, in the coaching landscape of endurance sports, and to a detriment?
Look, in a lot of sports, unfortunately, it's still perceived a little bit that way. And we can look at a number of sports have removed body composition measures when assessing athletes, especially in their talent development pathway, because in most cases, as athletes mature, they're going to change anyway. And so I think it's really important that we consider where the athlete is in their development and work on the aspects that we can work on that's actually going to improve them as the athlete. Now, quite often there is skill development, there's physiological development. Obviously, we need to promote and protect the psychological side of things as well. And again, if we do those things correctly, our body composition might adapt to fit the training and the nutrition that we're doing. And it's not always the most important component first. It's like people looking for those shortcuts with ergogenic aids and the rest of it. It's the last little bit that we might consider.
Yeah. And I find that also even from an injury perspective, and this is probably so much the same. I work with obviously mainly endurance athletes, and they'll say to me, I think I got this bone stress injury because I'm heavy. And I'm looking at them and they're not in the slightest. They'll go, but I'm 1 or 2 kilos heavier than before. I said, well, yeah, because you're in your off season and that's perfectly healthy. That's where your body is meant to be at the moment. And they've blamed this injury on their body weight instead of actually their training load or actually not taking in enough nutrition. I've even had an athlete who told me that someone else had told them their Achilles issue was because they'd put on a little bit of body weight, so every step was just such harder work for them. And it's just rubbish. It's not the main thing that you're thinking about when it comes to this injury. No, you got the tendinopathy because you did too much intensity, you didn't have enough recovery, you're not sleeping well, you're not fueling your body. That's the reason. It's not actually the body weight. So it's interesting to hear from your coaching perspective too, that I think often people do get caught up in that as a really meaningful thing when it's really not. You should look at how are we going to improve their power output, or these meaningful physiological changes instead of just fixating on one of the things that you can measure. I wanted to ask you, before we go through what we can measure and what is important or not, what is adipose tissue really? Because I feel like people think that body fat is just extra weight that they carry around. They don't see it as having any form of role. And when you look at it in that one-dimensional way, I think that can be quite detrimental. So if you could talk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting you sort of say that. And this is, again, where we look at historically in terms of how we measured body fat or why we measured body fat. And initially, some of it was done around after the Second World War and people under malnutrition. And so we were looking at how can we measure their body composition and what happens when we starve people, basically. And then through the 60s, we all of a sudden had this opportunity to have food and nutrients really easily, and we started to see obesity kick in. And then the association between having high levels of body fat and health was created. And so there's always that thought around how that body weight or that body fat related to health of a person, and it wasn't necessarily seen as anything positive. And I think that's where, when we start to think in the sporting context, it's like, okay, well, it's not healthy. We need to minimise it to be healthy anyway. But really, it's there for a whole host of different reasons. We wouldn't have it otherwise. So basically, it's a highly active endocrine organ. It's highly energy dense, so we can utilise it as an energy source. But it supports immune function, it influences different hormones, it helps regulate inflammation, and it plays a huge role in thermoregulation. And I think if we think about all those different components, it is a really important part of our bodies. And if those levels of body fat get too low, then those different functions of the body don't work as effectively. And so we need to maintain that. And if we're not, then it does lead to injuries. It does lead to inability to recover from normal training. And if we think of it from a positive, and again, if we're looking at endurance sport, I know primarily where we might be talking about running and cycling, where most people sort of think about endurance sport. But if we think about open water swimming, cold water, two things that are really awesome from a higher levels of body fat, subcutaneous fat, is that we have this insulation factor and we increase buoyancy, which can improve performance. So it can actually be quite beneficial in some sports. Look, if I think about the triathletes, especially the age group triathletes, standing around in transition going, when are they going to tell us we can wear a wetsuit? Because it's too cold for them.
Oh, yeah.
And they want that extra buoyancy. And basically you're putting on that extra couple of mils of insulation to protect you from the cold, which is why it happens because of how long you might spend in the water. And it improves your body position so you swim faster. So it's a natural way of doing it for those that are involved in those sort of sports like open water swimming.
Yeah, and I remember, I think I touched on this in our pod episode in your pod, but my honeymoon was just before the roto swim, and I was ecstatic because I knew I had to put on a little bit of body weight just to keep warm. And so I would go to that breakfast buffet like there is no tomorrow. And I just told myself, Kate, you are improving your performance. And it was the best training I've ever done is 10 laps of the breakfast buffet. But exactly, and it's almost like you can think of adipose tissue as this is not going to hinder my performance. I actually need this for my body functions and endocrine function. And when you touched on as well before that it is important and you need those reserves so you can function. If you think about the big endurance training loads that you're doing and you don't have enough of that in your body for normal life function, you are going to fall in the reds category, or you're going to be in that burnout. You are not going to hit your peak power. You're not going to be able to train for, if you're training for an Ironman, those 4, 5 or 6 hour sessions, they're just not going to be possible if you don't have that adequate reserves there in your body as well. And I definitely did see, and they touched on this, I believe in the review paper as well, about how in open water swimming, you know, that adipose tissue is really helpful. This is maybe a little bit off topic, but I did want to touch on, just because you said, you know, how it's a buoyancy effect there. I have read a paper that predicted that potentially female open water swimmers, because of the distribution of their body fat, could in however many years' time actually outperform male swimmers in the longer distance swimming. I know you're in the swimming scene. Have you heard this? And is this prediction? This is music to my ears, Grant. What do you think?
I mean, if you look historically, women have beaten men in open water swimming events on a regular basis. And there are plenty of West Australian open water swimmers historically who've had that success. So it's not something that we can look forward to. It does happen. And it depends on the distance, obviously. So the shorter the distance, then the male competitors, they're not as worried from a insulation perspective because they're doing the event quite quickly. But definitely the buoyancy component, as you said, we're talking, you know, if we're male, female, separating them out into two categories, but there's always going to be a distribution. But where that body fat typically is deposited is different between males and females, so that it does change where the centre of buoyancy is in relation to the centre of mass. And when we're looking at those two components, that's then going to change how much effort's required to maintain a body position that's flat in the water. If the two of them are further spread, so males will typically have their body fat higher up, whereas the ladies are generally a bit lower towards the hips. And so that then changes the way that they can float. And look, you watch them swim in the pool, and the guys generally will love to have a pool boy, whereas the ladies, and again, we're talking general terms, and doesn't give them as much of a benefit. So yeah, there is those really interesting things when we talk about body composition and how that can still change the way we perform, but we can't change where the body fat sits. So, like, we can't spot reduce. And when people
Please say that again, Brad. Please, because
doing 1,000 sit-ups will not reduce the body fat specifically on your abdominal region and nowhere else.
I have this though so often when people see me for strength training. Kate, I want to get rid of this. I'm like, okay, well, you're here for performance, number one. I don't really care about that. But two, I can't do that. That is where your body puts its fat stores. I'm sorry, that's it. You know, you can't. Sorry.
Yeah. And the changes that people might see potentially relates to the changes in the muscle structure underneath, which then changes the shape of someone.
Yes.
And so there's that perception that by doing those exercises changes that. And we do, obviously, if we do more exercise, we may reduce body fat at the same time as building muscle mass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so many powerful things in what you've just said there. And it is funny hearing you say about the pool boy as well. I always remember going to squat and leading my lane, feeling very proud of myself. And then, okay, now pool boy, I'll move back a few spots in the lane. This is no longer for me.
Yeah, and you'll notice it even in the swim run events, the same sort of thing, just the differences of who needs a big pool boy, who doesn't. Do we need flotation aids? You know, how much of a wetsuit am I going to wear? Those sort of things. It's really quite interesting.
Yes, and the floaty shorts, you know, the wetsuit shorts. There's so many men rock up to the swim sessions and go, I can't keep up unless I wear my floaty shorts. And then, you know, it is really interesting. And yeah, swim run events, some of the pool boys I see, I think, have you just taped 3 together? Is that even physically possible? Okay, so do you feel like then potentially what is more arguably easily measurable, such as measuring your adipose tissue. Do you feel like because maybe that's a little bit easier for athletes to access, they don't focus on other important things? So for example, I'll never hear athletes come to me and say, oh, but here's my lean muscle mass, or here's my bone health, or, they don't maybe put that same emphasis on measuring overall what's their fueling status. There's all these other factors that I feel like are more important to be measured, but there's always this fixation on this. What's your sort of input on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do focus on things that we can measure easily. And even if we look at from a training perspective, we might be able to measure heart rate easily, so we use that as a tool. But it doesn't necessarily take into account that it's a really hot day or I'm dehydrated. Same thing with this. I can measure body mass. I might be able to measure body fat, but how am I going to measure my lean mass, or how am I going to measure my bone density? Those things are much more difficult to do, or they're much more expensive to do, than to do it accurately. So we do tend to go to what is easy. And if you can, obviously you can interpret it differently. And if you're wanting to make change over time, then you can use those numbers as is there progress in whichever direction I want to go? But there are a lot more things that obviously, other than body fat, that are probably more relevant if we had the ability to measure them.
And can you list a couple of those things, Grant, that you would put as a priority to measure?
So I guess I'll come back to that if we can, but just first I'll give a bit of an example of a project that we did last year, which was around high performance rowers, and they have rib stress injuries on a regular basis, and it potentially takes them out for 6 months of the year, which then writes off their preparation for major competitions. So often these guys and girls would have a DEXA scan, which would give us a whole image of their body, and we can look at all different components. But rather than just having a look at that from a health perspective and go, do we actually have enough body fat, or do we have enough lean mass to make sure we're healthy? Can we measure the density of the ribs? Is that an aspect that we need to consider? And so for us, it was, okay, can we measure it accurately? Can we measure it reliably? If we could do that, then we can start to consider whether or not we can use it as a predictor or to assess it in terms of injury risk. So the initial parts of the study is going, we've got a tool that can do this. If we scan, can we really see the differences in those rib densities, in those bone densities? And we could, which is really awesome. And we compared the densities between rowers and rugby players and middle distance runners. And that's great. We can see, but what's interesting is their bone density was still healthy. Their healthy athletes had high levels of bone density, but we can see in that one region, there is some variability. So now it allows us to go back and say, can we explore this further? And can we see if there's a relationship? So if we look at the other endurance sports, if we look at running and cycling, etc., we're probably more interested in, do we have the lean mass and do we have the bone density? And even though those numbers might be suitable for the general population, possibly they need to be higher because of the strain that the body has to endure through their normal training and competition. And so if we can track that, then it certainly does help get an understanding of the athlete's health. However, to make changes in those components typically takes longer. And this is another thing where we go, okay, well, I can make a change in body fat relatively quick. But to see a change in bone density is going to take a long, long time. It's going to take months. To see even a change in muscle mass, we're going to see 6 to 12 weeks before we see any real change through training. And so sometimes getting the quick fix of body fat is always, let's go with that.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's all these cumulative things of, you kind of hear this bit of research, you hear this coach talk about that. It's something, like you said, you can quickly change, you can fairly easily measure it. So let's fixate on it instead of looking at the longer, more tedious stuff, which is always the way in sports science and performance. I think it's a little bit more, what's the quicker fix? What can we focus on and go from there? And it's really interesting that you touched on the bone mineral density, because I just talked about this a couple of episodes ago where we were talking about bone stress injuries, particularly in runners. We had a dietitian on the pod and we were discussing, she said that sometimes to get an idea of energy expenditure, it's useful to get the lean mass and you can sort of predict your energy expenditure from there. And I said to her, and then I would take the bone mineral density from these scans and figure out where I need to apply my strength training program. So it's really interesting to hear you say that. I used to do quite a bit of strength training for some rowers, and we'll do a lot of overhead work trying to load the bone mineral density through the ribs. And so it's just so refreshing to hear this all reinforced as well, and that focusing on that is important, especially in long distance runners too. I find probably a very similar occurrence in both stress injuries as your rowers too. And I'm guessing as well in the lightweight rowers probably more so, because you've got that emphasis on trying to make the weight.
And that, when we're looking at sports that have weight categories, then we start asking different questions about making weight. And is it a healthy way that they make weight versus the most productive way? And especially combat sports, quite often it's a dehydration protocol to get them in to meet those weight goals.
Yeah, I've seen that firsthand. It has not ended well with people I've seen trying to meet those the unhealthy way. I wanted to touch on then this measuring the things that are important, because I know that you did a study looking at a DEXA scan and ultrasound. And you did find that it was like dehydration from a previous session, and some factors affected the results of the DEXA scan, whereas not so much an ultrasound. If athletes are going to monitor something, what should they monitor and how?
Partly it's what tools do you have available, which is probably the first thing that we look at. And that's why, skin folds are done on a regular basis, because they're cheap and easy to get. But if your technician is not skilled, the error is massive. I mean, being out on your landmark by 0.5 centimetre can change your results by 10%. And if you're looking for small changes, then it's not really meaningful.
And it's quite a confrontational thing to do as well, if you are maybe a younger athlete as well.
Yeah. So looking at the tools you have available and having the skills to do that correctly becomes really important. I think if we look at the so the idea with the ultrasound was supposed to be a progression on skin folds, which removes some of the errors or the assumptions that we make when we measure skin folds about compressibility of the skin. We remove the thickness of the skin. And so with that, we were trying to work out whether or not we could use this effectively at different times within a training cycle, before or after training, that sort of thing. With the ultrasound, just like skin folds, it only measures the subcutaneous adipose tissue, so it gives you a fat measure, whereas a DEXA scan will give you the other components. So what we found, if we're only interested in that body fat part, then we could measure skin folds almost at any time, and we could measure ultrasound almost at any time, which, if we're working with an athlete population and they don't have time to come in fasted, hydrated, rested, all those things, and we can do it, tack it on the end of a training session, then great. Mm-hmm. But it's only going to give us that one component. So if we're using DEXA, we need to make sure that the presentation of the athlete is consistent. So they have to turn up, ideally, in the same condition every time. So we're not getting variation in their measurements based on whether they've just eaten a meal, whether they've just done exercise, those sorts of things. I've sweated, I'm going to change. If I've just had some food, it's going to change my lean mass. So all those things need to be taken into consideration when we do these measurements. And if we do a DEXA scan, though, we're not going to measure on a regular basis. It'll be every 3 to 6 months, if not longer. Whereas, again, some of these other tools allow us to measure more regularly. And again, only if we can track change on something that will actually occur, and it's a meaningful change.
Touching on the availability side of things, I often hear athletes say, I have these scales at home and they scan my body fat percentage, and yes, I saw your face, and my lean muscle mass, and they tell me my metabolic age. What's your take on these? Are they accurate, not?
So the accuracy is relatively low. However, most of them are fairly consistent. So if you wanted to track your own self across time, then you can see if changes occur. But if I was to use it and you were to use it, we might get wildly different results. So what does the number actually mean? Again, still standardizing that. So have you done it first thing in the morning after waking up, been to the toilet, all those sorts of really simple things. Are your feet clean? Because sometimes, or your hands clean, depending on what you're using to get this small current passing through the body for the bioelectric impedance. So that changes. So your hydration status changes how it measures. So all those little things still have to be standardized. There's obviously some that will claim they're very, very accurate. But again, as I say, the consistency quite often is okay. But between individuals, there's a lot more variation. And it becomes just a number. And look, you might, so those that are probably more familiar with things like using Garmin, etc., and they have different training metrics, even just your heart rate variability, whatever else. Those sorts of tools are really good. But again, it comes back to the individual about, this is what your sleep score is, or this is what your resting heart rate was. If you use the same piece of equipment every time, then you can watch change occur. But how accurate that is may not be the same as if we had a piece of equipment that is a lot more accurate to start with.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what about if someone just had normal scales, just normal body weight scales? Because it obviously gives you no idea of body composition whatsoever. So they might feel disheartened if there's no change in their body weight, but they could have had a change actually going on.
Yeah. So from that perspective, you're right. It's just mass. It is, how does my body interact with gravity? That's all it measures. And that can change over time, definitely. But it doesn't tell us anything about what we're made up of. So if we tie that in with our volume, then we can estimate our density, which is where these original ideas of how much body fat we had with the Seary equation, the Brozig equation, some great research, but some things haven't evolved much from that, unfortunately. So with just that mass, as you say, sometimes it doesn't go in the direction that people want. And this is where, if we wanted to tie in some other measurements, so we might add girths to that. So you might see whether, are my thigh girths getting larger because I'm actually doing some strength training? And because with training, we might see the muscle mass might increase and the body fat might decrease. And therefore, our body mass might stay the same, but our composition will become varied. And unless we've got other ways to sort of measure that, we're not going to get a true indication of how the body is changing or responding to the training stimulus or whatever other stimulus you're applying to try and get change. Scales, and again, from an endurance athlete point of view, they don't need to be used all the time, but we can, if we're not trying, two things I'd say. If we're not trying to lose weight, and we are, then it's a pretty good sign that we're getting unwell. And so if you do happen to track body mass, then potentially, and you see it dropping off very rapidly, it's probably a sign that you better go and see a doctor. The other one, the thing I would like to use it for is if I'm going to exercise in the heat, long sessions. And so it might give you an indication of how much I've sweated. So my body mass has changed pre to post session. I've obviously lost the majority of that through sweat. So that can give me an indication of how I might want to change my nutrition plan through training and through competition, but also how I might want to recover. Because obviously as we dehydrate, our performance will decline, our decision-making declines. So there is a place to use scales in the endurance world. But again, it's not necessarily what is the number, it's what is the change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to wrap up this conversation up very soon because I know I've taken up a lot of your time, but I just wanted to touch on one last thing about race weight. And my perspective on race weight is it should be whatever the body weight is that gets you to the start line in the healthiest, best position of having had trained consistently as you could and ticked off as many of those boxes as you could. And I always say, whatever weight that is, that has enabled you to do that and get to start line healthy, that's your race weight. It's not a number, it's just, I personally never even weigh myself because I just go by how I feel and how's my performance going. But I wanted to ask you, Grant, if you could replace the phrase race weight with something better, what would it be? And what do you think is a more helpful target or mindset for endurance athletes?
Yeah, when you sort of posed this question to me the other day, I was just like, It's really quite challenging to think, well, how could you reword this or make it in a way that will help athletes have success? And really, it's about being ready for performance. So performance readiness, which is sort of similar to what you've just sort of said, there's no magic number, and we're all different heights. We all have different types of training leading into competition, whatever it happens to be. So it's not ever going to be this magic number. And even if we're using it as a weight, then again, it doesn't tell us what the composition is. So just because we're targeting that doesn't necessarily mean we're building the right aspects. So have I actually increased my lean mass to where it should be? So I think performance readiness is probably broader. So are we resilient? Are we fueling correctly? Are we strong enough? Do we have the bone health? Can I consistently train? I mean, if I want to have success, especially in endurance sport, I need to be able to turn up to training day after day. I need to be able to recover. Is my psychological well-being okay? If I'm always stressed about what my body weight is, I'm thinking about that and I'm thinking, well, can I eat that, or should I be doing extra training? Or then it creates additional stress. And we want a healthy, happy athlete. And when we look at most of the national programs now, when they look at their performance pyramid and about what's required to be successful or win when it matters, the number one or the bottom part of that pyramid is about the healthy athlete. The training comes second. If we're not a healthy athlete, we can't train. And so I think if we remove race weight, and I know, again, as you said at the start, endurance athletes sometimes focus on this, but if we remove that and just think, I want to be an athlete that can consistently train, I want to be healthy, and I want to be ready to perform when it's time.
Amazing. I think that is, I just want to take that and just paste it everywhere for endurance athletes, because I think that is just, probably the biggest take home that we could get from this episode. And everybody, that is coming from Grant, that combines a beautiful combination of his research. He's so heavily involved in the endurance scene. He is a triathlon coach. He's had many years of experience, and you've got someone who is that heavily involved in the research and then translating that over to your performance and coaching and making sure you're a happy, healthy athlete first really is the key. And Grant, before you go, I know you have your own podcast. Could you please share with our listeners about your pod and what it's called so they can follow along as well?
Thanks, Kate. So my podcast is called The Science and Art of Open Water Swimming. It's very similar in concept, I guess, to what you're doing, with the aim of talking about this endurance sport with swimming as the primary component, but bringing in the science that relates to improved swimming, the safety, and all those different aspects that we sort of talk about, but we've got this idea that, I think this is what so-and-so did, so I'm going to copy them. But why do they do it? Why do they do these things in these certain ways? Looking at how waves interact with a swimmer, looking at the physiology, looking at the differences between males and females. So all those sort of different aspects and how that can make you hopefully enjoy the water a lot more. And so it's just bringing that intersection of science, swimming and open water all together.
Amazing. I feel like this would be helpful for a lot of, especially our triathlete listeners who maybe tend to forget about open water swimming, or they've come more from a running or bike background and have learned to swim as adults. Would this be a helpful place for them to go to for all those resources? Yeah,
certainly. It's not about the high performance necessarily. Those athletes will certainly gain something from it. But it's about all those basic things. One of the recent ones was from Dr. Olivia Stewart. So she is an optometrist, and we talked about vision and choosing the right goggles and all those sorts of simple things, which do seem quite simple, but different people will have different experiences in these environments. And we're trying to just touch on those aspects that might help people enjoy the swimming more.
I saw this episode because I was going through your pod the other day and I thought, what a genius episode, because this is something I never nail. I never get that goggle choice right. And sometimes I'm out there for so long and I've got a headache almost by the end because my lens is too bright, and then I've got to go do a bike run after. Yep. So those things are key. So there you go to any of the listeners. Definitely recommend you tune into Grant's podcast and have a listen there. And he doesn't have Instagram. But I hear his podcast has Facebook. So
yes.
Is that the best way to follow you there as well?
Yeah, definitely. Follow along on Facebook with a middle-aged interviewer. Uh, we're hoping to get my children onto upgrading my social media at some point.
You'll get there one day, Grant, don't worry. All right, thank you very much.
No worries. Before we wrap up, I just want to take a moment to say a genuine thank you to Dr. Kate Baldwin for that conversation and for generously allowing me to share it here. If you enjoyed this discussion, I'd strongly encourage you to check out Kate's podcast, The Distance Doctor in Practice. Kate brings a really thoughtful, clinically informed lens to endurance sport, and this conversation sits within a broader body of work she's doing around athlete health, behaviour, and long-term performance. I've included links to the original episode and her podcast in the show notes. From an open water swimming perspective, I think one of the key take-home messages here is that body composition only matters in context. In the water, especially cold, long duration, open environments, things like buoyancy, insulation, fatigue resistance, and robustness often matter far more than chasing a specific number on the scales. Rather than thinking about race weight, a more useful question for swimmers is whether your body is ready for the demands of the event. Can you train consistently, recover well, regulate temperature, and hold an effective position in the water for the duration? For most open water swimmers, health, resilience, and performance readiness aren't separate goals. They're the same thing. And thanks to a gentle nudge from Kate, the podcast has finally joined Instagram. You can now find us at Science and Art of OWS for episode updates and the occasional swim-related insight. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the water.